This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And this is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And I'm running through some summer things now. Tuesday night was interesting. Usually Tuesday night is city meeting night, and I either go there or follow it on city computer. The alternatives this week were a couple. I'd gotten ready for a city meeting, and I was talking to T.J. Blakeman with the hope that I would present an idea of a windshield corridor to Paxton, and so he is a planner, but also he's on state boards as a planner, and this would be a statewide trail. So I didn't do that anymore because there was no meeting. So I went to the Oregon Street meet, which I enjoy, a bunch of alternate people, and we meet there, but I often miss that because of the Tuesday. The other alternative was to go to Guido's. The Grand Prairie Friends has a game there that they run on Tuesday night between 5:30 and 7, and it's to raise funds for the Grand Prairie Friends, but it also brings people together. There's a Queen of Hearts game, and there's a bounty if you take tickets, and it's a sort of a raffle, a very extended raffle, and the rules of the game are very distinct, and you can perhaps win on that day, and some of the funds will go to the Grand Prairie Friends. So I was kind of interested in going to the Oregon Street meet because there's been a change in the city council, and there's now an administrator, and the administrator has been making some rules for events that are at independent media, and so there's been some debate about that. So these are little things that you partake with. I was talking to Daniel Chenoweth's mother, who was visiting from out of state, and just all in all, a small group, but meets regularly. Then that was Tuesday. By Wednesday, we're getting ready for the parade, for the Freedom Parade. So I had a little go-kart to pull, which said Champaign County was 94% prairie. Now it's 0.01%. And so it was a simple statement, but I heard people on the way making comments like, that's quite a statistic. Well, I was doing it some because I'm anxious to see that the Kickapoo Trail the next phase is not so wide that it takes out all of the prairie. When we're down to next to nothing, it's really a serious act to take out the original soil and prairie that's on either side of the ballast. The trail doesn't have to be 10 feet wide. It can be much narrower than that. And the first part is providing for a bedroom community in St. Joe. The next part will be going towards Danville, and it doesn't have the same bedroom community capacity. So WEF was there. They had made an exhibit that was according to the rules of the game. There's a space unit, and that was kind of exciting. I was running early so I could come back and view the WEF float. Friday evening was interesting because we had a 40 North each Friday evening has 3 locations in downtown Champaign, might be 4, that where music is played, and it's right outside Weft, right outside of Heartland Pathways, and rather wonderful. There was a woman as a solo with a very nice voice, and one that would project, and then it was followed by a band that is called the Whiskey Shadows, and they were having a kind of riotous time. They were enjoying this, and so I asked them how they got into this in the first place. Well, they came to these sort of Friday night events and thought that they could do this. A bunch of them are music graduates, and they were doing very well, very active, interacting with the audience. They would get the audience to clip and clip and clip, or plaque, and David might even put up they have something on YouTube, so if you can go to YouTube with that name, you might be able to get some of their sound. And the small children were having a riotous time. They were running around after each other and just merging with the band, and I thought that was rather wonderful. It was followed by a band that came from Pittsburgh that was on the Poor Beer Garden, and that was working very well into the late hours. The street event runs to about 8 o'clock. Just a time when people relax, they bring their chairs and sit down, and we may have a picture or two of that crowd. I didn't go to the other units because there's so much happening outside my own front door, but it was a nice evening for everyone, and it didn't rain. It rained a little later. I went to the farmer's market. It's another place in summertime that's rather wonderful. People get there, they don't always buy a lot of fruit and vegetables. They talk to each other a lot. They get to know each other, and that's a community event. The farmers markets across the globe are having somewhat of a difficulty because they have the industry, the food industry, has decided to buy up territories and produce organic food, and it's somewhat in competition with the markets. Early on, they didn't have that advantage, but we hope that the farmers' markets will keep going. There's one in Champaign, which is on a Tuesday night also. Lots of things happen Tuesday night. And It's smaller. It hasn't got the character of being in one place for a long time. It's moved around, but it hopes that it will stay in this place and perhaps even grow. I met up with Kim Campbell and we chatted away for a while and parked under a tree later and enjoyed a drink together. And that, again, is where we do informal debate about what we do with our resources and things like that. I had a phone call from Susan Taylor to say that she'd just gone down Iowa Street and the native plants out on the street, in that part of the street which is on the roadside side of the walkway. It's usually controlled by the city, but the city is pretty tolerant about people planting into that. And so I was interested in just recording some of the flowers. The yellow cornflowers are coming out, along with purple cornflowers. There was thimbleweed and Canada wild rye and dock. The dock plant was huge. It's like 3 feet across, and it's all this fruiting bodies coming up. Sometimes docks can get to be quite large, especially if you have them in your yard. They can take over because they have young ones, and so they're fecund. Then there was a red pea bum. I was outside by this time, outside Bob Steak's place, and there was orange milkweed, and orange milkweed is interesting. It services butterflies. It's also fairly dramatic. So it's in amongst the other wildlife, you get things like golden Alexander, and because there's a tree in the front yard of the Steaks, it provides shade, so you get things like mayapple. While I was there with the Steak household, I thought I'd call Bob Steak. He was he's been an education professor of note, and I thought he might know something about alternate forms of education in the Paxton area. We're looking at that old Royer School, and one of the things we might want to simulate, perhaps, is something like Ed 2, where you have students that have a different way of learning, are different beings, and the Ed 2 that was in Bantam did very well with students. Sometimes they're frustrated because they've learned much more biology than they get in their biology class. So they go off to places like Big Bend in Texas and write a trail guide, and then the National Park Service still uses that trail guide. So the Ed 2 and other alternate schools, I think Champaign has one, they do an excellent job. I don't know how you handle, when you have 4,000 students, how you do independent study and research, but certainly there's room for people who want to do alternative things. And sometimes they're kind of dramatic in what they want to do. They have a mind of their own. They know what they would like to follow. If it's rockets, it's rockets. It's and they acquire information very quickly. It requires teachers with a lot of talent to pick up on the things that those people want to do. Sometimes it may be someone with a deficiency in some area, but a tremendous advantage in others. So you concentrate on the advantage area and find out what they want to do. ADA people fall into that category. Well, Bob had some thoughts, but not a lot because he hasn't been in that field for quite a while. but his wife, Bernadine, who unfortunately recently passed, did some work with mathematics in the Paxton area, and there's some move afoot to do some mathematic work in the Rantoul area, which is the other end of this 10 miles. He's also working on genealogy, and he has a Scandinavian base, a Norwegian base, but it's mixed up with, we're all mixed puppies. So he has this printout, which is about a yard and a half long, that is very detailed as to where various members of the family have come from. I visited across the road. The Stake family has a house that faces onto Carl Park, and they have planted 2 memorial trees for Bernadine, who used to love that park. I was cruising on. Last week we were speaking about the architect Royer. We had Brian Adams on, and he had indicated that there are quite a lot of Royer houses and buildings in Champaign-Urbana and surrounding communities, and also interstate. He had put together a book about the Royer. One of the things we were talking about was a little historic district where Royer had a family home, and behind it he had a mother-in-law house. And this is a quaint little house, and some members of the family have written stories which include gnomes and creatures, and so I visited that just to follow up on what Brian Adams was indicating. I also went up the road on Lincoln Avenue past a sorority that has been repurposed as an apartment building, another Royer house. And so we're looking at places where there's an example of this sort of thing happening. So instead of tearing down the building, which costs a lot of money, and then you have to pay a lot to eliminate the asbestos, how do you bring those resources together, save them? There's brick and tile, and this is a substantial building. If you take it down, you have to deal with the asbestos, which costs perhaps $1,025,000 to eliminate, and then it has to go somewhere like Kansas and be buried in a place where you know it, and by survey, and the cost is tremendous. To leave the building is a good thought, and to perhaps buy the building or to transfer it to the city. We don't know quite what to do there, but we're looking for examples across the country where buildings like that, especially schools, have been functional reuse. And there are a lot of examples, so we would like to take those to Paxton and perhaps see how we could handle the school preservation. It is always convenient to pull a building fairly quickly so that there's not a lot of opposing historic memory and interest. But we would like to at least have the opportunity to ask what they want to sell the building. That alternative hasn't seemed to have risen yet. But if someone were to buy it and restore it, the suggestion is that the classrooms could be dormitories, or they could be motel rooms, and leave it fairly intact. There's going to be a sale on the 13th of July. It's a Saturday, and they'll sell all sorts of pieces, some of which may be of interest if you are going to preserve. But the main thing is to how to either convince the school board that there are other alternatives, like alternative forms of education, or to transfer that to a body that would be concerned. There's a fairly strong population of people who have signed a petition to preserve the building. It runs around 500 people at the moment, and is increasing. There's also a lot of comment in the newspaper to get rid of this building. It's only one block off of 45, and if we're thinking of putting in a trace from Kankakee through to Cairo, then with cultural as well as natural history opportunities, then this could well be a visitor center. I'm thinking of Iowa with cross-sectional diagrams for soil containers, or wet to dry, the geology, some of the species, to introduce people to the heritage that we have of East Central Illinois, which was 94% prairie for Champaign County, and about the same for the counties around. So I was interested to see that the sorority building is used. I walked across the road, and the university has a rain garden, and that's another thing that we can be interested in. You can have a detention pond to preserve water, and you can have perhaps a fountain in it which will aerate the water. You can have organisms in that corridor. You can have water that runs in from the associated landscape, and you can plant plants that are associated with water, and wetland species, dry species, and the like. And so that to me was interesting. I came home and left the windows of my car open, and then later, as I was working inside with the computer, it had a downpour. So I took my boots off and waded across the road, which was about 2 inches deep in water at the time, and wound my windows up. So now my vehicle is drying out with the windows open. But that's part of the climate change that we have had locally. Many of the farmers that we know do not have their crops planted because the rain and the consistent rain and heavy rain, and the fields are so moist you can't get into them. And even if you do plant the corn, which is usually knee-high or perhaps even much higher by this time, was planted late, and it's only knee-high. And so this is going to be a major conflict for the nation, because the crops, Midwest-wise, have had a hard time this season. It's not unknown in agricultural circles that seasons change. It's also the same with biological creatures. The one thought about monarch butterflies being low in number now is that they got caught with climate changes that they didn't expect, and their flight patterns were altered, and perhaps it exterminated a number of the creatures. I want to say something about a book. I'm looking at my time. Okay. Jeffords, Post, and Wiley have authored a book. It's very, very recent. It's Butterflies in Illinois. And one of the things we want to do with the like of 10 miles from Rantoul to Paxton and on to Kankakee is to let people know that this is areas where organisms can get together. And we know that from graver and graver studies where you study perhaps the range of birds in 1900 and then do it again in the 1960s, and you find that the population has gone dramatically down. Well, the same thing occurs for butterflies. Even in this book, it's suggested that you photograph the butterfly, not collect the butterfly, because in some cases there's so few of them that will reduce the population of creatures. It has been in the past that we can really collect, and so many of the museums have collections of birds and small mammals and creatures, some of which no longer exist. Jeff and Post and Weil are all entomologists who are expert in butterflies, but they're also experts in other forms of insect populations. They know the families. They are wanting to write a book that is not necessarily full of academic jargon, but more for the lay people, but it's also very effective for professional people too. They say that, and they say that this is an educational device. They have all the pictures of half of a butterfly on the very front of the book that gives you an idea of the structural detail of the butterfly you're looking at, so you can quickly get an idea of what you're looking at. They, at the back, they turn those butterflies upside down, and you can see what's the underpinning side of the, which is sometimes different. They want to get you out in the field, and they want you to know a little bit about the creatures and how they behave. And it may be that we've been watching at Rantoul on the Pope Prairie, we've been watching butterflies that have mating dances that are kind of interesting, and they're not just random. And you need to know what food preferences there are. You need to know the metamorphosis, the egg, larva, pupa, adult sequence, and sometimes the larva and the pupa are very interesting. The pupa of a monarch butterfly is just got little sequences of gold and green, and just wonderful to look at. You're encouraged to find places where butterflies will accumulate. That means areas that are big enough for several creatures to get together and for them to mate. We have fewer and fewer of those places, and it's a little cruel to realize that when you lose the habitat, you also lose the creatures. So your visit to the boondocks to see butterflies is helpful. Can you succeed at doing this? Well, perhaps not. You have to know that the creatures may be here in summer, but may be migrating here in summer. You may have creatures that stay here and don't migrate. You may have creatures that are fairly rare. You may have creatures that are much more discoverable. So if you're wanting to suggest that this is what is your success, you have to have the talent to be able to find places and be read enough to perhaps know where things are. So each species is given details, and it might be the distribution map. So do you go to northern Illinois to find certain creatures, or go to southern Illinois, or is it in between a vague area? Perhaps in southern Illinois there's nothing. So if you're looking for a certain member of the family, if you have a butterfly checklist, there's about 100 different butterflies in Illinois, and as in birding, you have people who count their list of birds that they have seen, and they're rather proud of it. Well, the same goes for butterflies. The name is there in accuracy, but the common name is often used, so you know your way around. There's a little chart of when the creature is in town. It might be May, June, July, but not in March and April. In other cases, especially with plants, we have some plants like liliaceous plants that come up very early in the spring. There's a skunk cabbage which is here when the snow is still on the ground, and so these sort of diagrams to give you a period of when the butterfly is here. They give photographs, and they give details of the patterns. Some creatures have patterns that have big eyes on them, almost as if to frighten off birds. Some creatures have elements of biochemistry that are not very exciting for birds of prey. So these little details are there, but there are extensive details to say what do you look for? What do you look for in a dog-faced butterfly that you can't even see because the wings are over it? But when you get it into the office, you can open that up and see why it was named that way. But the surveys do have good collections, and they probably still do collect. Some of the creatures are from the neighboring states, like Arkansas or Iowa, so they're occasional visitors, and you may need to find the counterpart book that gives you information about that. But I'm rather fond of what Post and Jeffords and White are doing, because you need this book in your pocket to go visit the butterflies of Illinois. They give an idea of the divisions of the state, as the state has divided things up into river areas, prairie areas, and northern areas like Joe Davies County, which, if you wanted to find a creature that was working with the ecosystem there, you would end up in areas that haven't been glaciated in Joe Davies County, and so that information is there. Some creatures have certain flight patterns that make them easy to find. Some creatures like to all get together and drink water out of a puddle, and you can often find a lot of butterflies together in that sort of situation. some butterflies, and this is more a case of dragonflies, I think, but they don't want to be bothered with too much aggressive mating behaviors, and they can simulate other creatures. So there's an adaptation that if they take it too far to avoid copulation, they will make it so that they don't mate. But they have this balance where they can copy some other creature. So if something is poisonous and they make it themselves look like they're poisonous, then they're going to avoid attack by birds and things like that. There are habitat areas, and the habitats vary, and so knowing your habitat helps you to find a butterfly if you've gotten that degree of specificity. There are butterflies that like to be individuals, but there are also butterflies that work in crowds. And there's quite a bit of research that intrigues researchers to find out how these creatures get together. How do plants get together? How do they exchange information with minor biochemicals? And how do birds fly? How do they all decide to turn and fly in the one place? How do they know how to come to home to a site? It may have something to do with the electromagnetic nature of the world. And some of these things are so minor that we don't have the sensitivity to know the difference. But the creatures often have real sensitivity to do that. You can probably inspire young people to look at butterflies. You may have to capture a few and even preserve a few. I can remember as a high school student, I got very interested in entomology, and I had made little boxes, and I knew how to first of all collect and exterminate the butterfly, so that you could then pin it out and put little notes on it. And note-taking is fairly important, especially if you're going to be helpful to researchers, to give notes of where, on what date, and under what circumstances. That's a very interesting part of collecting. But many young people have had the first introduction to entomology by looking at creatures. I was talking to Kim Campbell yesterday, and there was a bee, and we couldn't work out what the bee was after. It looked like it was looking for salt. It would be on your arm or on your body somewhere. It did not look like it was looking for sugars or nectar. It was, but it was. It's not the sort of creature you want to whack at, because this moment you whack at it, it releases a whole bunch of biochemicals, and you're likely to have a lot of friendly bees very mad at you. So you got to be very careful, especially with creatures that get into your hair. Just treat them very, very carefully, because wasps and other creatures can respond in a manner that you might not enjoy. Bully to the University of Illinois for printing this book. It costs about $20, but it's well worth the investment, and it is especially worthwhile for us as we try to increase the area between Paxton and Rantoul. So, looking at
16 minutes.
Okay. One of the things we're doing at the moment is trying to eliminate invasive creatures. So I went to the farmers market to the Master Naturalist booth, and we've been talking quite a lot, and David has been doing the Master Naturalist program. And they were there, and they were looking at, they had a little booklet on invasive species. And many of you don't know the difference between an invasive species and a prairie species, because in general, the prairie looks like a bunch of weeds. But they were very well aware, the two people that were in the booth, one had done Master Gardener and Master Naturalist, and the other one had done the Master Naturalist, and they were accumulating their hours, and I think, I'm not quite sure about the hours, I think it's 60 hours.
Right. Well, the way it works is there are 10 6-hour sessions where you learn about the nature of Illinois, and at the end of that there's a test which I guess no one has ever flunked, and then you, from the beginning of that class through the entire next year, you're required to do 60 hours of volunteer work working with nature groups. Like, for example, when I work with you, Dave, that counts, and also when I work over at the Children's Museum, we had a pollinator week, and I put in some hours as volunteer, not as an employee there. And so by the end of this year, I need to have completed 60 hours of volunteer work, and then every year after that, to be considered an ongoing Master Naturalist, I have to do another 30 hours of volunteer work and 10 hours of continuing education.
That's the second piece which I didn't quite understand. 30 hours of further experience and 10 hours of continuing education.
And being where we are, it's ridiculously easy to get both of those. Both Champaign and Urbana Park districts are always looking for volunteers. My mentor, in fact, for the class was Mike Davis, the head of the Champaign Park district natural areas, and the extension itself, which coordinates both the gardeners and the naturalists, have almost every week an hour-long or 2-hour-long panel or a discussion. Somebody comes in from the university. Good grief, you've got all these people who know this stuff backwards and forwards come to the extension and give a talk, and that's worth an hour or two of continuing education.
Well, remind people of the administration side of it. Is out of NRS.
It's part of ACES. It's part of the College of ACES, which is agriculture and Lord only knows. It was agriculture when I was in school, and now they've combined several other things.
Community affairs.
Yes. Okay.
Pankow was in charge of the Master Naturalist and Master Gardeners, but now you have another person has come.
Right, Amanda, who I believe you met when you were at the table.
Yes, and she is now in charge of the Master Naturalist program.
Right.
And they do very well. They're informing a lot of people of a lot of details which make it possible for others of us who are more in the rough and tough business of trying to preserve some of the corridors that are interesting. I was intrigued a little bit by some of the people I was watching over the weekend, and it includes people who are out in the field. The singers and the musicians were basically eating their microphones, and they knew how. But if you are in the field with naturalists, then there are some techniques. And one of the techniques is, if you do have to have a amplification, that you are right on top of the microphone. Please don't have 30 people with one person way out and away from a microphone, especially if it's on a windy day. People only get part of the message. And so we beg people to have small amplification things. A bullhorn is not a good substitute. It's loud, but it's not awfully generous in terms of the quality of the sound wave that's coming from it. And you have to direct it. And if you have people spread out, you have to direct it to one direction and the other direction. And that means that half your crew doesn't get to hear what you want. And you also need little places where you can have tools. You need real estate that's not going to be violated. As long as you put up a Kmart special barn on the Pope Prairie, it's going to be broken into. How do you have someone who, like Packer, who has a warehouse and is very careful about moving and shaking tools? And the tools may include pickup trucks and simple equipment, but it may also include high-hoes and backhoes and pieces of equipment where you need specialists. And somehow you need a CEO in these situations, a person who brings together all the paperwork and all the details. And many of these organizations have that sort of organization. Grand Prairie Friends has Sarah Livesey, and she is the coordinator of that sort of program. Then you need people who are out there that spend quite a bit of generous time, and so some of those people get actually recognized. And so you may have 150 people to plant trees on a certain day, but you need perhaps 10 people who know what they're doing to bring that together. And, David, you might have some comment to say about the recognition of people that have spent a lot of their time working on these sorts of projects.
Well, as a matter of fact, talking about the Master Naturalists, earlier in the summer, we had our annual get-together admitting, I guess you'd call it, the new Master Naturalists, people who had, since last year, completed their 60 hours or whatever and had become Master Naturalists. And there were categories. There are some people who've done stunning amounts of, tens of thousands of hours cumulatively of work volunteering, clearing away things, yeah, exactly, things that you don't want around. Yes, and what is it? Mustard something or other.
Yes, it's a crucifer that gets into forests, especially, and it has a mustard flavor to it, or mustard.
Right. So I think you probably would get a fair amount of work out of most of these people without the recognition, but it is really nice for somebody to say, "Hey, congratulations, good job on all that time that you've put in and all your diligence and help in the community."
Those are the people that end up on boards too, that help to administer things. One of the things that is important to do, and WEF does it fairly well, is to record what the volunteer time is, because when you're asking for a grant, then the records of the time spent, even though it may not give credit to the person who's doing the work, it gives credentials to the organization that's putting in for a grant. So I talked to Elizabeth Kirby, who does a lot of this sort of work, removing teasel and removing often honeysuckle and autumn olive, to record not only the time she spends there, but the cost of the gasoline to get there, and there's a little bit of tax involvement in the equipment that they use. If you're going to go and buy a machete, that's a cost. If you're going to have to run a pickup truck that gets there and gets back, then that's a cost. So there's some overhead that you. So those of us who are not totally organized don't do this sort of thing. We just do it and that's done. But really, the people who are very organized, and I must give credit to the recreators because they do it tremendously well. They count the numbers of people that are in certain programs, and they spend probably 1/3 of their life documenting what they're doing. Because then if Cargill is going to put money into the Kickapoo Trail, then they need some information that says what do we do and what has been done. So there's another dimension is to have a record of what is done and some idea of the future. So you need a plan for the future, and you need a plan for 100 years, but you need a plan for 10 years, and you need a 5-year plan and a 1-year plan, and you need to budget to that plan if you're lucky enough to have the budget opportunity. So strategic action plans are good. They don't necessarily have to be written in concrete. They are more likely to change as different people come, as different ideas emerge. But it's very helpful to have some skeleton to which you're working. If we're working on a restoration of a railroad bed from Whiteheath to Seymour, then you know it's going to take a long time. But you plan for the future, and you hope that you can meet that deadline. You don't want to make deadlines so outrageous that it never happens. But you certainly in one generation needs to put together the skeleton that's there for another generation to work with. It boggles my mind to raise the money. We've been working with links so that we can get you links. So I've had links that go to Australia, that go to other places, and I've been amazed that using Facebook has brought us attention, and so time has to be applied to moving and shaking your ideas. So part of the reason for going into the parade is to let people know that you are in action and that you have a commission, and it is fairly serious. I'm just looking at David's sweatshirt, and he has on it Katy Trail. Yep. And Katy Trail is interesting in this sort of discussion because Katy Trail followed another trail across Missouri that the public lost because there was so much opposition from farmland. But Katy Trail came, and then some person, I don't know the details, decided to buy the Katy Trail. And so when you go to a meeting and the Katy Trail people are talking, they're kind of apologetic because they came into a trail where there was money already involved. And that's another thing that you have to watch, is that people out there are watching you and seeing whether you do interesting things. And then out of the blue, sometimes very interesting things happen, and the Katy Trail people are very aware of that. And they've got 200 miles between St. Louis and Kansas City, and they're expanding it, and north and south. people use it. It's a chipped limestone trail, and there's little stories all the way along. You can go to one town called Defiance, and Defiance was between railroad lines were usually 5 miles apart before elevators, but every once in a while you find that there's 2 miles to an elevator or a small town. Well, Defiance decided that they were going to have the railroad, so there's stores back. The front of the store backs onto the railroad, but when the roads came in, the other side of the store fronts onto the road. So you have to know that little piece of history. Up on the hill, there's vineyards, and the vineyards are in times of prohibition. They were in difficulty, but they've come back, and they're on the uplands. So you have to know something about the uplands and the bottomlands. You have to know about slave trade, because there's little cemeteries up there that have graves but no labels on them. But they're slave places. I think we're near the end.
Yep.
This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.